Dear guests and panelists in today's event, science is moving the world, and we humans are moved by science. Science has created new possibilities, but also created new means of mass destruction. Science is binding us together as never before, at the same time as science is part of a global competition in a world divided by geopolitics. Therefore, science is definitely important for understanding foreign policy. In a series of lectures in commemoration of the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, the Foreign Policy Society focuses on the international aspects of science and its relevance to Danish foreign policy. The lecture series is arranged in connection with the celebration of the centennial of the Niels Bohr Institute and as a prelude to the National Science Year in 2022. Bohr's atomic model was led indirectly to the development of the atomic bomb. The peaceful scientist, like everyone else, was shaken to his core by seeing what his atomic model evolved into. Until his death in 1962, therefore, Niels Bohr worked to create an open dialogue between all the nations of the world. Already in 1944, in a memorandum, he said the following to the US President Roosevelt: "There is hardly anyone whose imagination is able to foresee the consequences that the nuclear project will have in the coming years, where in the long run the enormous energy sources that will be available can be expected to revolutionize industry and the means of transportation. However, the immediate overriding circumstance is that a weapon of unique strength, which will completely change all future conditions of warfare, is being created." And in 1950, he wrote an open letter to the UN on the principles which should govern international cooperation in the light of the powers released with the invention of the nuclear weapon. So today, we will look at the issue of nuclear disarmament and the status of nuclear buildup in the world today, and the dynamics this entails, as well as the relevance of Niels Bohr's open letter to the UN in our world today. So welcome to Dan Smith, the director of the famous Stockholm Institute, International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, to Carina Ann Meyn, PhD in International Relations, Assistant Professor, Institute of Strategy at the Royal Danish Defence College, and Ole Væver, Professor of International Relations, Director of Center for Resolution of International Conflict, University of Copenhagen. And I will first pass on the word to Director Dan Smith. Welcome, Dan, and welcome here on the screen. Dan will stay on with us for the whole session, so we will also be able to ask questions to him. He's in Stockholm at the moment, but we are here with him. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you to the Danish Foreign Policy Society for setting this up and inviting me to speak. I've been asked to give some remarks which sort of do something to set the background, set the scene in terms of nuclear weapons in the world today. So I would have liked to be able to put some numbers on the screen in a presentation that you could see, but unfortunately the numbers which I'm going to give you are a foretaste of ones that we only officially release next week. So at the moment, I can't display them in a way that would be easier for you. To set this in context, in about 1985 or 86, there were some 65,000 to 70,000 nuclear warheads worldwide. The vast majority of those owned by the United States of America and by the Soviet Union, and then by the other nuclear weapon states at the time. In January 2021, our estimate is that the number of nuclear weapons worldwide is 13,080. In other words, there's been a decline from about 65,000 to just 13,000 nuclear warheads during that time. And in some ways, if you think of that as being good news, if you focus on the decline in the numbers, which is the good news, whereas the numbers which are left perhaps are the bad news. In terms of the reduction in numbers, the further good news is that of those 13,080 nuclear warheads, 3,500 of them have actually been retired and are waiting to be dismantled. So they're stacked away, they're being kept safe for the moment until they're taken apart. And then the number will be down below 10,000. Of those 10,000, 5,700 are actually sitting in storage. Although they are deployable nuclear warheads, they're not currently on missiles and bombers. Only 3,825 nuclear warheads worldwide, mostly on US and Russian missiles and bombers. And those are the ones which are operationally deployed and are ready to go at a moment's notice. So how should one look at that? Well, on the one hand, a reduction from 65,000 to 13,000 is impressive, is encouraging. It shows what can be done by way of nuclear arms reductions. On the other hand, the states which have nuclear weapons are all engaged in upgrading and modernizing their nuclear arsenals in one way or another. It is possible that the number of deployed nuclear warheads is now going to increase, so that while the total comes down as the old ones are dismantled and broken up, new ones are deployed on missiles and bombers. It's possible. So the picture isn't perhaps quite as rosy as it might look, just judging by the numbers. And going further down that rather dark alleyway, bilateral nuclear arms control between the USA and Russia came to the point of collapse in 2020. I think everybody in this kind of audience will be aware that the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was abandoned first by the USA and then by Russia. Similarly, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty that was signed during the Cold War had been abandoned first by the USA and then by Russia. And now it appeared that the last agreement left standing, the New START agreement. START is an acronym of Strategic Arms Reduction Talks. And the New START agreement that was signed in 2010 came into force in 2011, would run out in February 2021. And the US administration under Donald Trump was saying for most of last year that it would only renew it under certain circumstances which were very unlikely to come about. I'll come back to that in a moment. The incoming Biden administration immediately did what was necessary to extend New START for a further 5 years, which was an action permitted in the treaty if both sides agreed. So New START is still there. But that close encounter with a possibility of there being no such control, no such internationally agreed regulation on the nuclear weapons of the USA and Russia, I think gives one pause for thought. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has been signed, but it is still not in force because the key states, the nuclear weapon states that actually might do nuclear testing, have not ratified it. And also on the multilateral front, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is in some difficulties. Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1970, or came into force in 1970, sorry. And so 2020 was its 50th anniversary. And every 5 years, there is a review conference of the treaty. So there should have been one in 2020. It was postponed because of the pandemic from April of last year until, first of all, January of this year. Then it was postponed again until August of this year. And now it looks like it will be postponed again until the early part of next year. And in some ways, you have to say that at least the first postponement was good news. Because if with New START collapsing, bilateral arms control basically at death's door, they had gone into the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, then I think there was every possibility that, as has happened before, the NPT review conference would not have been an occasion for discussing how to strengthen the treaty, but rather an occasion for hostility and animosity, resentment from the non-nuclear weapon states. The Non-Proliferation Treaty contains at its core a bargain, and it's an unusual treaty because it is in a way both a treaty of arms control, which is to prevent new states from getting nuclear weapons, but also a treaty of disarmament, because Article 6 of the treaty says that those states that have nuclear weapons should be undertaking negotiations and arriving at agreements to get rid of those nuclear weapons, and in fact lead on to a treaty of general and complete disarmament. And though the number of nuclear weapons has come down dramatically, as we have seen, they're still there. Each side, between Russia and the US, has in the vicinity of 1,700 nuclear warheads which are deployed on bombers and missiles. And those, while much smaller than the totals that there were in the Cold War, are more than enough to do unprecedented catastrophic damage on a scale which it is hard for the human mind to imagine. As I said, all the nuclear weapon states are conducting upgrading programs at the moment. When the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, there were 5 states that were known to have nuclear weapons: the USA, the Soviet Union, the UK, France, and China. There was a 6th which had nuclear weapons, but it wasn't known publicly at the time. That was Israel. And since then, 3 more states have joined that very small club: India, Pakistan, and North Korea, in that order. At the same time, during the 1990s, states that came out of the Soviet Union, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, could all have kept nuclear weapons and decided not to. And in addition, South Africa gave up an active nuclear weapon program. So from 6 nuclear weapon states to 9 in the course of 50 years, that's not a perfect record for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it suggests that the non-proliferation regime, the story, has been one of a reasonable degree of success. That success is threatened now by the nuclear weapon states wanting to modernize, wanting clearly not to give up their nuclear weapons, while the non-nuclear weapon states are developing a much stronger voice. And it's out of that clash that came the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, also known as the Nuclear Ban Treaty, which has now entered into force because it's been signed by or ratified by more than 50 states. So that's the picture. It's a little bit mixed. Perhaps if you are an inveterate optimist, you focus on the reduction in the number of nuclear weapons. Perhaps if you are an inveterate pessimist, you focus on that there are still 10,000 active nuclear weapons remaining. Perhaps if you are an inveterate optimist, you say, well, after all, there's only 3 new nuclear weapon states in the last 50 years, and 4 possible nuclear weapon states gave up the option. And if you're an inveterate pessimist, then perhaps you say, yeah, but there's still 9 nuclear weapon states there. And there's enough knowledge worldwide for there to be far more. Let me finish with one last point, which is that there are new technologies coming along which introduce a new dimensions of possibility as far as nuclear strategies are concerned. And the track record of nuclear strategy over the past 50 or 60 years is to be interested by possibilities for example, limited use of nuclear weapons, finding ways to end a nuclear war to advantage, in other words, to win a nuclear war. And those ways of thinking, those doctrines are making a return now into Russian and American nuclear thinking. So I'll end there. Thank you for your attention. And with my deepest apologies that you are forced to conduct this meeting in English in order to to handle the fact that I'm going to stay online. But that's because I'm interested in the meeting and interested also in questions and discussion. Thanks very much, Charlotte.
Thank you, Dan. I just have an additional question, which is also related both to Niels Bohr and his thoughts, as well as to the work that CIPRI does. Because what is actually the availability of information regarding nuclear, nuclear weapons? Is that accessible? Do you know, with regard to China, with regard to Pakistan, how do you actually dig up the information around, the weapon systems?
The USA is the most transparent of the nuclear weapon states. Britain recently reduced its degree of transparency earlier this year, but it's still pretty transparent, as is France, pretty transparent. You don't know everything, haven't got all the numbers. And when we present the tables, we show which parts we're sure about, the tables with the statistics, I mean. We show which parts we're sure about and where we're making certain assumptions. Now, with the other states, as you started to imply by mentioning Pakistan, there's a number of estimates which have to be made. And these estimates are made on the basis of a number of kind of clues and hints. We know how much material of different kinds is needed to make nuclear weapons of particular sizes. We know what kind of size of warhead can fit on that sort of missile. We know what kind of size bomb can be carried by that kind of bomber. We know how many of those bombers Pakistan has. Indeed, we have a pretty good idea of how many of these bombers China has, and so on. And so we add the information together and we draw conclusions, and these are estimates, not facts, but they're estimates which we feel, and many other experts feel, reasonably comfortable about. There's occasionally a question raised about some of the figures because, for example, we round them. So if you look at what's happened with India and Pakistan's totals in our estimates each year, they go up perhaps a bit more smoothly than reality would be likely, but that's about the best we can do for an estimate. When it comes to Israel, that doesn't even say that it has nuclear weapons. Then we're also making quite big assumptions, but we think we know enough about Israeli armed forces and again about the nuclear physics to be able to say we think they have 90 nuclear warheads. And as to North Korea, well, then we are really going on the basis of how much nuclear material it is estimated that they could have produced running the reactors that they have and the enrichment program that they have, and what the size of their missiles looks like and what it would take to get functioning nuclear explosives onto those missiles. So there's a number of steps, and sometimes the estimates feel a bit heroic, but that's the best that is available until governments become more transparent.
Thank you, Dan. Now I'll give the word to Carina Ann Meyn from the Royal Defence College, and you will stay on for the debate later on and the Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the very interesting presentation. I think if I should sum up what the difference is, mainly between the threat that we used to know very well during the Cold War and the new dynamics that we see underway, I would say that I think Robert Oppenheimer perhaps best encapsulated what was about to happen when he was warning US policymakers what would ensue if they didn't take the threat of nuclear weapons seriously and commit to international negotiations. So his foundational metaphor for talking about nuclear weapons and the very strained dynamics that they would give rise to was this image of two scorpions in a bottle. So you have this image of a very, very aggressive and threatening animal caught in a tiny little space, ready to attack its opponent. And I think this metaphor is very useful because we're used to thinking of nuclear weapons dynamics mainly in a two-player framework and as a very highly dramatic screenplay almost of good guys across from bad guys, dramatic tension, and somebody has to prevent the end of the world. And that's very well if you can create a nice film where it can end in a nice and peaceful way in the end after a lot of tension. But the challenge now is that we have far more actors in the world with nuclear weapons. And also, there's a challenge of interpretation between these actors. Because mainly, even in the US today, policymakers still make sense of nuclear threats and nuclear weapons dynamics according to theories that were originally formulated during the 1950s. It still guides how nuclear weapons are spoken about. It still determines who is taken more seriously in an academic debate, which points to the future. So there are a lot of blind spots in how politicians and so-called experts are still talking about these issues. So I would say that's still a big point of concern. And as Dan has also mentioned, a big difference from then until now is that we find ourselves in not so much a quantitative arms race, but there is definitely a new qualitative arms race happening. And the reason this is particularly challenging is that as human beings, it's easiest for us to focus on one issue at the time. But the dynamics that are now an integrated part of nuclear weapons issues also cover issues related to cyber technology, new types of missile technology, conventional precision weapons, and a whole host of other issues, outer space developments, anti-satellite capabilities. So from being a question that almost everyone in the public was concerned about during the Cold War, everybody had a visceral sense of the very clear danger of nuclear weapons and the increasing arms race. Today, I would say the main threat from the new arms race is that not enough people understand it, and not enough people can sense it with their body. During the Cold War, people had gut-wrenching feelings about the possibility of nuclear war. That's not really the case any longer. And the new technical developments are very, very hard to follow even for experts at times. So those would be my points.
Yeah. You say that that we're actually looking at the world with old theoretical eyes, but the world has changed. So it's not the bipolar world. So we're used to looking at the nuclear deterrence from a west-east point of view, but the whole dynamics of nuclear deterrence has changed. How has it changed? Like, how would you say we need to think about it today?
Well, actually, if we, to make a short reference to Niels Bohr, it's become so complicated and complex that the new buzzword for experts is entanglement, which is taken from quantum theory. And when people reference entanglement, what they're talking about is that there are new actors, many new technologies, and several domains, several military domains that you have to be aware of at the same time. So the burger is getting more layered and complicated, and more people are involved in wanting to eat it, so to speak. So the analytical challenge is also quite formidable because how do you model for all those factors all at once in a way that makes possible an intelligent and critical debate about what the new pitfalls are and what the new dangers are for misunderstandings, miscommunications, and close calls, because we have had quite a lot of those during the Cold War. And one of the great inventions of nuclear arms control were the red telephones. And I think that's a great invention, but it's almost laughable in today's terms if you think about computer networks and how complex systems can be hacked into, and an entire political system destabilized and left guessing. What do we have that is working, and what is actually happening to us?
We heard from Dan the fact that a lot of the treaties and the systems that we actually established during the Cold War is now running out, and we have a system which we're not regulated in the same way. The framework for discussions around nuclear disarmament is actually falling apart. What does that mean? You know, that we used to talk about confidence-building measures and this. Where do we actually build confidence in this world of new powers and everything?
Yeah. Well, I think Biden has already said this in some of his big foreign policy speeches. According to his estimation, the US is now at an inflection point in international relations. And I think this goes very much to the point of institution building, norms building, and how do you prevent the most serious security dynamics from developing in a direction that you actually really would prefer not to happen. And I think actually, if you look at the people who are often advising him, they are very much aware of these complex dynamics and interlinking agendas. Because, maybe a more simple way of saying this is that the security dilemma has gone from a simple equation to a long and complex equation. So what that means in practice is that the experts that are advising Biden will most likely be directing him to expand nuclear arms control to whole new areas. And I think I'm not sure that we can expect the same structural developments for these new areas, but I think that there will be a willingness to open up discussions for international norms and how gentlemen's agreements, in a sense, of new areas of technology. But it's a complicated question because these new areas of technology are also seen as being very, very important for the US to invest in a timely manner, because they're now focused on China and the ascension of China. So there are different concerns that are pulling in each their direction.
And I heard that China has an ambition to be the third nuclear power. Like, they want to be number 3 in the amount of nuclear weapons available. So they are actually also, they say, say number 3. I don't know why they didn't say number 1, but do you have an idea?
Well, China, is interesting from a nuclear weapons perspective, because they've always had a very, very pacifist nuclear doctrine. They have a no first use doctrine. They've always been very clear and open about that. And it's also part of their long-term rhetoric that it belongs to the imperialist powers to use nuclear weapons in a power projecting and potentially coercive way. But there's a lot of speculation about the direction that China is planning to go in. And estimations vary quite significantly on this question, depending what type of analysts you're reading. But clearly, there are those who are worried that China will also expand their nuclear weapons arsenal. But what I would say is that we've been used to thinking about the US and the Soviet Union, now Russia, as being the two big nuclear powers. And they still are, but they will likely negotiate down even further. But even though the numbers may come down, the tensions and the long-term challenges of these weapons dynamics still continue, but they continue in new technological areas that are just as important. Because when, for example, the New York Times reports that the US has been able to hack their way into North Korean nuclear missiles, that is something that both Russia and China read with interest. And it's a significant development. And the question, I mean, one of the new questions that emerges as a strategic question is, I mean, for these powers who are used to thinking about their nuclear weapons as their existential home free card, is in a crisis, will we actually have the authority over our own nuclear weapons, or can we be absolutely confident that our command and control system will be working the way that we have designed it and intended in our war plans? Or does our opponent have control over something that we are not yet aware of?
Thank you, Carina. And now I'll ask Ole to take it from there. I hope it fits with the narrative.
Oh yes, it fits very, very well. You gave me the perfect lines here at the end about the kind of dilemmas of the interest in new forms of cooperation, and also the rivalry among the powers. That is very much what I'm going to be playing with. And I'm very much doing the Niels Bohr thing here. I'll be talking about Niels Bohr and his open letter, and try to talk about how that is relevant today. So in the spirit of openness, I think I'll start by letting out a secret. And that is that the University of Copenhagen has been doing in the past, that's not a secret, that's known, we have been doing in the past big conferences on an open world. We did in 1985, and quite interestingly, feeding in ideas into what became the whole Gorbachev reforms and so on. Really, they are using also a conference about an open world to practice it in a sense of making back channels between Soviet Union and the US and so on. We had another one in '89. We had a big one in 2013 in the anniversary of the scientific articles where the atomic model were published. And now I can tell you we will have a big open world conference again in November next year, and that one building up to an even bigger one in 2025, which obviously is the 75 years anniversary of the open letter itself. So you can look forward to more on Niels Bohr, the open world, the open letter, and all of that. And there's a good reason to do that, because I'm going to argue here that Niels Bohr's approach as presented in the open letter and the idea of an open world is actually much more sophisticated and unique than it's often understood. And it's also peculiarly relevant to the situation we're in today. I'll say less about nuclear weapons as such, and more about some of the new technologies that share very much the situation that nuclear weapons was in at the time he was writing. And that would be issues like artificial intelligence, quantum computing today. These obviously have then implications for nuclear stability again, because these are the places where one side could potentially suddenly outcompete the other one and break through all their secrecy and be able to actually, as we just heard, in a sense also control the weapons of the other side and so on. It's one of the major destabilizing factors also inside the nuclear system in that, in addition to be in themselves extremely powerful. So I'm not going to talk about whether the principle of the open world can be used today on nuclear weapons as such. I'm actually a bit confused about that. I very much agree with what Dan Smith was saying, that there are new nuclear dangers today, and we should take the nuclear issue much more serious than we do very often. There's a new technological phase, and there's also a non-proliferation crisis. I'm not really sure, I can't think out myself how an open world is a solution to that in the direct sense, but I look forward in discussion to maybe finding out. But I do think that the open world is the key to avoiding extremely destabilizing developments in some of these other technologies. And it's quite appropriate, of course, that we, in a dual sense, that we take questions like this back to Copenhagen to discuss, both because quantum breakthroughs were made here, but also, and this is what we're talking about now, how to handle dangers of destabilizing arms races in areas like this were exactly what Niels Bohr was thinking about. Today's race might be different in the sense that ultimately the biggest race in artificial intelligence and so on might be a race between very different kinds of parties, like maybe it's Google and the Chinese state who are ultimately the biggest rivals and have the biggest potential to make the ultimate breakthrough in artificial intelligence. So the private-public setup is very different. These technologies are not driven by military technologies. They're driven as civilian technologies with spillover in the military. So there are some significant differences, but the competitive logic and the implications of competition versus the handling it through openness is the same question. And we know all that Niels Bohr's open letter was his main preoccupation for the last many years of his life, the whole idea to try to use his particular insights into these scientific and technological areas to convince politicians to handle it differently was his key message, and he tried to influence Churchill and Roosevelt, particularly by private meetings and letters and so on. And at first his idea was basically to say, from when he first heard about the Manhattan Project in 1943, after fleeing from Denmark, his first reaction immediately was to worry about the long-term implications of that after the war, and therefore saying it was crucial to tell the Soviets that there was this project, not telling them the content of it, but to let them showing that we would take them into understanding what was going on, which was flatly denied from especially Churchill. And what is interesting here is how this is anchored in many respects in the science itself. It was both his understanding of how openness is kind of key to science itself as an institution, but also that his understanding of the nature of this science and technology gave him a more radical idea of how different it would be. And he had radical ideas both on the danger side and the opportunity side, and saw those two in his own sense of complementarity, the dangers and the opportunity, but both by taking serious how radically different the new technologies would be. And that was strikingly summarized in an event that many of you have probably heard about already, when Bohr met Churchill, and Bohr's argument was that this is so radically different that it will mean a completely different, it will recast the nature of politics, which was proven totally right. The Cold War became a very different kind of political conflict from anything we had seen before. And the nature of the strategic arms race and the nature of the strategic field became radically different. Whereas Churchill, who otherwise was pretty competent on military matters, military history and so on, basically said that the atomic bomb was just a bigger bomb and would make no difference to the principles of war. And here Bohr was the better military historian than Churchill in the sense that he understood how radically different things suddenly become at turning points. And we are at some similar turning points in relation to things like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. And there's also the similarity that if these technologies are allowed to run free, they will be this will be happening in a competitive, secretive form, and that was exactly what Bohr was pointing to at that time, that the spillover effects of doing it as a secretive competition would be destructive, both for our societies, which we certainly learned during the Cold War, and for the potential that could otherwise have been realized from these new technologies. So Niels Bohr's idea of openness is often misrepresented as much more naive than it was, that it was an idea that if we are just open, it creates trust and harmony in the world or something like that. That was not the idea. The idea was simply to say, how do we avoid the competitive, destructive arms race in that? And that can only be done by making it transparent and shared. His warning was also different from that of, for instance, Einstein and other of the scientists at the time. It was not so much the danger of nuclear war itself, it was the danger of the nuclear arms race and the impact on science and culture, and this, again, the central role of secrecy coming out of that. So that, and this is of course what links back to the basic ethos of science being openness. So if we are now heading into a new quantum arms race, then I think it's more crucial, even in this quantum and artificial intelligence arms races, that these are handled in terms of openness, in the sense that the research frontier is happening in the shared space. We can't expect Google to make their research in artificial intelligence public. We can't expect the Chinese state to do so either. The only way to avoid this dangerous arms race is that the public shared international research is ahead of them. So it's only by outcompeting the competitors by the open science that this can be avoided. I think that is more crucial than ever, that we have a chance of having the classical scientific institutions being the space that develops these things. And this is crucial because of two dangers coming out of these new technologies, and which can be summed up in a sense of two different kinds of geopolitics of these new technologies. One is the geopolitics in the sense that they are currently developed competitively between the main powers. And these are races in the classical sense, because a real important arms race is not just the fact that you are competing like this, just a little more, a little less. It is those races, the dangerous arms races are those where you fear that suddenly one side can jump ahead and thereby totally transform the equation. If one has a breakthrough in quantum computing, meaning all your computers are suddenly 100 times as powerful as the others, then it really changes the game in a sense that it's extremely destabilizing. That is very different from just competing like we have a few more airplanes than they have or whatever. It's this kind of arms race that is dangerous. So it's the geopolitics in the sense of the competition, which is particularly dangerous with these technologies because they can take these leaps. And there's a geopolitics in the second sense that we collectively is threatened by these new technologies. There are potential implications of artificial intelligence and so on that are threatening to all of mankind. And those are more likely handled if we are not competing at the same time. Competitive systems are likely to push safety concerns aside because it's more important to win the race. And all the safety concerns that people who are worried about the radical potential of artificial intelligence bring up is formulated as if we were kind of we collectively dividing these technologies. But we aren't. We're developing them in a competitive race against each other. Then people are not going to take all those safety concerns. So again, the only way to avoid the dangers from the technologies themselves is to have a thorough international investment in classical open science so that these radically new technologies are developed in the collective space instead of the rivaling space. I think this was Bohr was thinking about in relation to the nuclear revolution, and it's extremely relevant to our situation today. So it's quite appropriate that the quantum development that he started, and he's thinking about how open the open world is the answer to danger that come together again, and comes together in Copenhagen in that sense. So it's something that we should take upon ourselves to develop this argument. Thank you.
Thank you, Ole. It's extremely a bit scary. Should we be concerned? Yes.
Please be afraid.
Yeah. What I would like to know is, what is the discussion about these things in the international settings, like in the Security Council? Is there a discussion on, the fact that we have not discussed these things? Are there any sort of consensus, or is there a lack of leadership? Is that the
And there's a lack of putting the picture together right, I think, in the sense that these are discussed very separately, in the sense that we could have meetings where we say, okay, there are dangers of new transformative technologies. Can we make rules for this? And how do we make sure that we code the artificial intelligence so that it's ultimately friendly and not going to kill us, and so on? And that we kind of can discuss as a collective we over here. Can we collaborate on that? Then we black out the fact that we are not near actually doing it like that, because over here we are competing. And then we have the arms control discussions and so on, kind of. And then again, in many ways, things are moving in the wrong direction at the time, because we have increasing discussions about we should be worried about having Chinese scientists in our university because maybe they're spies and so on. So international science cooperation is going backwards in the most important areas, worries about dual-use technologies and so on. So in many ways, we are actually further away from getting at the right.
Because when I conceived this series, I was thinking very much about science diplomacy, that science could actually build bridges on climate, on things, on health. But it seems as if that in the year that has passed, that we are actually no longer speaking together as scientists anymore.
I agree that science diplomacy is a big part of the solution, but when at the same time this creeping worry that actually we should be more and more suspicious of the other side, then we are moving in the opposite direction. And I think that the only way to counter that is to actually get real big resources into also international collaborative research things like CERN, and kind of saying there are some issues that are so big that they should be done by internationalized global research endeavors instead of in the national system.
I remember Obama's appointed man in NASA. I think he called himself the administrator. He said that the space research should not be carried out by one country alone, because you need so much money to do it. So we should do it in collaboration. But that has also changed. Now we don't even share.
That's fine.
So there is reasons for concern. Can you see any movements with the Biden administration that would actually go in another direction?
No, as you already said, there are very contradictory trends, because on the one hand, they of course, so much of the Biden administration is defined by being anti-Trump, and Trump was anti-Obama, and so on. So a lot of things are given just by wanting to do the opposite, right? So the idea of saying, no, we are the ones who can do the kind of cooperation that they couldn't. So in a sense, they would be super happy of having some visionary multilateral real cooperation project. And at the same time, so far, the more important things are actually structured, as you rightly said, exactly by the anti-China policy and so on. But so in that sense, you could say, if someone could sell them the vision, I mean, after all, the Biden administration has proven quite willing in all kind of domestic issues to surprise everyone by going bigger and quicker than anyone expected. So please, someone sell this idea that you actually have to circumvent the kind of overtake this whole rivalry by a new internationalist initiative. I don't think they're against the kind of thinking, but there are quite a few steps to get there to sell them.
So your conference will have to feed into this.
Yeah, we have to get them to listen.
Well, now we'll have a sort of a common debate. So Susie is now moving some. So Carina, if you will come up here, and then we'll have Dan on the screen. And I think now, Dan, you have been listening to the discussion. So I would like to ask you maybe if you have any comments to what has been said by Carina and Ole.
Yes, I think the first thing is that to underline the point that if there is something that going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe 15 years, that one thinks of is, you could use the expression arms race for. It won't be an arms race, so far as we can see at the moment from CIPRI. It won't be an arms race like the arms race from the 1950s through to the end of the 1970s, early 1980s, which was essentially not so much that it was a numerical arms race, though it had that element, but it was an arms race within the same kind of category of weapons. You've got bombers, I want faster bombers. You've now shifted to missiles, I'm getting my missiles. Remember the missile gap from the Kennedy-Nixon election in 1960. You're putting multiple warheads on, I'm putting more multiple warheads on, and I'm making them independently targetable, and now you're doing that, and so on. I think that there will be much more asymmetrical competition going on. Secondly, I then very much agree with what Ulla was saying, which is that about the way in which the competition gets in the way of the cooperation. And this is in a context where we don't need only to think about the technology as the source of that problem. I mean, there is toxicity in geopolitics is at an unusually high level at the moment, and has been for the last 5 or 6 years. And it's actually, the developments really predate Trump, which makes them more worrying, because if they were purely Trumpian, then that would be, you could perhaps calm yourself by thinking it was an aberration. Although I worry that the extent to which we're trying to comfort ourselves that Trump was an aberration in American politics is a little bit misleading. No need to go into that at the moment, but the American domestic political scene offers many causes for worry about all of this. And the last thing then, not because I'm trying to, in some sense, compete in terms of nightmare, but if one looks at the toxic geopolitics and then at the sort of technological challenges to our ways of thinking that are thrown up by technologies like, well, I'm not sure that there is a technology like quantum computing, but the technology of quantum computing, of artificial intelligence and so on. And at the same time, you look at the consequences of the pressure that humanity has put upon the natural environment over the past 50 to 60 years of social and economic development. And one sees a very difficult mix. To sum up very quickly, we have problems on the technology side and on the natural environment side for which we need unprecedented degrees of cooperation at a time when we are not seeing very much appetite for completely precedented amounts of cooperation. I'll stop there before I run away with this.
Okay, thank you. So Carina, do you think we should be worried, or do you have comments to what Dan and Ole said?
Well, I agree very much with the analysis. So one could say that we, in a certain sense, are in a period where we suffer from a bit of catastrophe and crisis overload. And when people, politicians are under stress, it becomes more difficult to imagine positive new futures. But I also worry, just from a basic cultural and sociological perspective, because the nuclear scientists were so good in coming together and advocating as a common international group, because they knew what they were working on, they knew the implications of it, they were able to project forward in time what are the really horrific implications of this, and they took common responsibility in presenting their findings and their concerns to policymakers, both in the US and the UK, and they even convinced the Minister of War very very adeptly during the Second World War of their cause. So he wrote many memoranda to President Truman saying, you need to take this seriously, they're making a really important argument. And Eisenhower, when he was a general at that time, also bought into their argument and accepted their line of thinking. And he also was trying to help persuade President Truman not to do what he ultimately did. So they had enormous powers of persuasion because they were one group, they knew what they were working on, and they had a relatively similar working culture and common experience with what they were working on. I think the challenges that we are facing now is that we're faced with potential big leaps in developments, but it's very hard to see who are the really important intellectuals that are going to drive this normative and very important public debate forward. I don't really see them making quite the same impact. I mean, I wish it could be organized and fostered at a. So I really like Ole's idea, both the very visionary one, but I think there's also a very practical networking, getting everyone on the same page, challenge to consider, because we're also talking about scientists from many different fields who have to make advances at the same time, and they also have to know where each other are coming from. So I think that's a major challenge.
Ole, do you have a sort of a commentary to that, or
No,
because
I very much agree. It's a very good point. It's a very, very good point that we don't have the same kind of leaders today. It's like the visionaries now just set up a startup company and make money instead, or whatever. I mean, it's I mean, those who kind of see where things can be moved to, they do the wrong things instead. It's a good point. It's a good point.
Okay, I will open up the floor to questions. Anna will hold the microphone, and you will just speak into it. And there might also be questions from the audience outside. So yes,
Thank you.
Nikolai?
Since experiencing at a distance the Cuban crisis at the age of 12, I've been scared of nuclear weapons. But when you mention quantum computing, one area which is also expected to be revolutionized by that technology is that of genetic engineering, which leads me to think of to ask you what your thoughts are about whether biological weapons will become a viable alternative to nuclear weapons. For one thing, I assume they must be very cheap to produce. You can buy a DNA printer which will print out actual DNA at the same type as a paper and ordinary paper printer, which we use, everyone, etc. I assume it's more suitable at this moment for terrorists, since channels of contagion are difficult to control. But I mean, they must be working on these issues. So if it's cheap, how do you see these dangers from biological and chemical weapons as compared to nuclear? I mean, they are both of them are radically cheap compared to nuclear weapons. So are they rivals? So how do you see that picture, you guys?
Carina, would you?
Well, I have to confess that biological weapons is not my area that I follow, really. But usually, I mean, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons are always studied and discussed alongside each other. And it's clear that there need to be more policy initiatives put into place to counter the threat that you're talking about. But my general impression is that, I mean, much of this was dismantled under Trump if we're talking about the US readiness on the biological weapons side. But it's an integrated part of the intelligence sector to stay on top of developments. And I mean, these are who are acquiring what sort of technologies. So there's a monitoring system in place, and I personally don't know how up to date that is, or if it's lacking in funding, or if they need new concepts for dealing with the latest challenges. But maybe Ole knows more than I do.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I would like to maybe shift the angle a bit in two ways on that. I mean, first, if we think about biological weapons in the narrow sense, it's quite clear that I mean, first of all, I totally agree with your question. I mean, if I list 3 technologies, the third would be genetic engineering and all that, and kind of an artificial produced viruses and all that. I mean, there's a lot happening there, and it's obviously so. And the parallel to some of the other things that I'm worried about is that these are, again, not starting out as military technology. It's not driven by the military having a huge program in that. It's driven by a lot of things happening in very basic research that shift the boundary of what is possible. And it's therefore more or less unavoidable that there will be new possibilities opening up, not because we wanted them, but they're coming. So that's why it's a very dangerous area, because it's clearly unstoppable, uncontrollable. And that's why, again, I think one has to take an indirect approach to it and have to redirect it somewhere else to handle it, not by controlling it. And that is uncontrollable was quite visible in the sense that there was a case 10 years ago or so where there were research on some of these things that classical open research that was on its way to getting published into, I don't remember, Nature or Science, where they had to stop it and say, this is too dangerous, because this would be immediately usable by the wrong people. And it's kind of unheard of to say, this is open, there was nothing wrong with it, it wasn't had no bad input in any sense, it was just something we couldn't let people know. And that gave really problems of how do you handle that as a scientific institution. And I think you can't keep the lid on that forever. So eventually also there was found ways of doing it, but the only solution I think must be to somehow, again, dialectically make sure that it's not dangerous anymore by the knowledge being sufficiently shared and thereby also the ways to handle it being shared. So, but that is not always working. That's in a sense a technical issue whether you can do that. Could you say the same with nuclear weapons? Great if everyone could make their own nuclear bomb, as long as everyone knows how to do it, then no. Not a very nice scenario, right? So that it doesn't always work like that. But I think we have to try to think the other way around, of thinking that openness has to be the solution, not keeping the lid on. So that's one side of it, that that you will be able to do things that are in the neighborhood of biological weapons as a spin-off from basic research. Then the other thing, to go back to my more science fiction-like issues with the artificial intelligence and so on also, I mean, of course in the whole biological area, there's also the whole question of kind of human improvement I mean, who are we? How are we going to remain one already given kind of species, or will we start competing in improving on human beings, which is again has this dual danger nature, that it's both a threat in itself. Do we want those kind of developments? Are they threatening who we are as human beings? And also, it will become a part of the competition. If you can make more intelligent or stronger human beings in one country, it should be able to outcompete the others and so on. So the whole idea of starting to modify who we are is also an outcome, which again is getting us into the most crazy science fiction scenarios of saying, what if we don't really think of ourselves anymore as the same species? I mean, that outdoes all issues of racism and so on. If we're starting to really think we're developed into different species by the technological manipulations we've gotten into. So I think there are some of these technologies that really have security implications in this dual sense in ways we really have to think hard about. The dangerous in themselves and they change the nature of the competition that we are confronting. And again, these are not to be controlled away. There's no way of saying we are not going to develop these capabilities. That is not viable. So you can only redirect them And the best way to redirect them is probably to internationalize them.
Thank you. There's a question there.
Thank you. It's a question for Dan. When do you estimate that Iran will become a nuclear power, and which are the next 3 countries in line to become nuclear powers?
To be honest, I don't think Iran will become a nuclear power, a nuclear weapon state, that's to say. But if it wants to, it would probably take somewhere, I think at the moment the estimate would be between 5 and 8 years. It can do it, but the supreme leader has so often declared that nuclear weapons are abomination and that Iran stands by the ratification of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that I think the balance of probability is against Iran moving down that path. There is evidence that it wanted to, or that it was exploring it, although it's not clear how full-hearted the exploration was up until about 2003. But it had clearly stepped away from the actual weapons ambition before pressure came on it. I think that the next 3 nuclear weapon states, it's extremely difficult to say. That any state that has got an active nuclear power program has got the capacity and the knowledge. One place where I think this is going to become an active discussion is in South Korea. I know some Koreans who have begun to say that if North Korea has nuclear weapons, they don't see any alternative but that South Korea will do as well. If South Korea does, I think that it's possible that things may change in Japan, despite and if there is political pressure inside Japan to start developing nuclear weapons, that will be a massive political issue of political division in that country because of the memory of Hiroshima. Apart from that, I would have thought that they are probably Middle Eastern states that one might think about. I just wanted to comment, if I may do as well, on the previous issue that was raised. I understand why Ulla is saying, thinking about human enhancement, that it's crazy and it's science fiction, but it may be crazy, but it isn't fiction, unfortunately. We have been at conferences where people have been talking quite straightforwardly and relatively openly about the possibility of that. If you want further examples of what can be done, brain hacking is not out of the question now. That's to say, just like you can hack into a computer system, you could possibly hack into a neural system. I'm not saying that there is a system or a technology that exists that can be used at the moment, but people are talking relatively openly and relatively calmly about that. And the last issue, I think, is in terms of thinking about biological weapons. We think about them as weapons of mass destruction. I think, as Carina said, they've always been thought of as chemical, biological, nuclear weapons, all thought of together as WMD, weapons of mass destruction. But there are issues of, first of all, there are possibilities with hostile use of bacteriological and biological agents, which are not to do with sort of spreading disease amongst people. It could be, for example, spreading disease amongst plants. And that could have an effect on agriculture, and that would have an effect on food security, and it would be a long and different kind of set of consequences rolling out. And the other set of thoughts that discussion of biosecurity raises is, of course, that there is now this potentially explosive discussion going on about the origins of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that lab leaks do happen all the time. And that biosecurity, biosafety is not nearly what it should be. And this is something where I think that I agree with Uli that you cannot legislate these technologies out of existence. But here is one where some relatively straightforward safety regulations, if universally applied, would have us all sleeping a lot more soundly in our beds at night.
Thank you, Dan. Is there questions? Yeah, Sven Erik?
I have a question about risk assessment for nuclear war. The risk assessment which we are discussing is all coming from scientists, Niels Bohr, as we're discussing today. My question is, do you think, and that's particularly a question to Ole, to what extent do you think that political science can develop into an international open community which can also contribute to the risk assessments like the scientists have done? I'm really missing risk assessment from political scientists.
Yeah. I think the biggest difference is not that we are not doing things, but so far we are not dangerous enough. So we don't have the same competitive logic so much. We are not controlled as much because we are not. It might something be worrying if we say something that is politically not so opportune and so on, and then we see in China, or we see increasingly in a country like Denmark, worries about what scientists should say and so on. But the fear that we are so powerful that you have to control us in order to get the benefit before someone else gets it is unfortunately not really so much of a worry. So in many ways we are already more international in the sense that we can collaborate more freely, and we do so. But it's interesting that we're pointing to risk assessments in the sense that there is a kind of emerging issue, maybe not so much in political science, but partly more in my other affiliation, kind of peace and conflict research, that there is a sense that we might be coming closer and closer to being able to predict conflicts. And if we start to put that out, that will be seen as extremely political. So if you meet it in different contexts. You can meet it, for instance, in studies like climate change and conflict. It's quite clear that can't be dealt with as an isolated issue. It's not like climate change generates conflict. If you start from there, you find out that there's a whole network of why some countries more likely to react to climate change in a way that leads to conflict. So if you start to map out all of these complex dynamics, in some sense you can start to say to decision makers, these are the likely places that things would go wrong and so on. And that's one side of it. Another side is even in the whole UN system, and there was a big report a few years ago called Pathways to Peace, where both the World Bank and the UN system came together for the first time of a kind of big state-of-the-art about how do we deal with conflict. One of the conclusions being prevention is better than cure, which we always knew, but somehow you can only prevent if you can predict to some extent. And there is a general sense that actually we can probably predict more than we ever could. I would, for kind of very principled reasons, think you can never predict human beings. We are fortunately always unruly enough that you can never predict. But still, in a bigger picture, at least statistically and in some ways, we are getting better at that. And I think you're pointing to something interesting, that kind of knowledge would be extremely controversial. I mean, no country wants to be labeled as saying, oh, you're the dangerous, you're one that's going to blow up next. I mean, at least sometimes you might want to, because you can then get money for saying, you better save us, otherwise we're dangerous. But in other cases, certainly you don't want to be labeled as the dangerous one. So it's quite clear it's a controversial area we are moving into there, and there might be some parallels to it. So you're onto something very true. I don't think it's risk assessments in the general sense. That is done, World Economic Forum and so on. The kind of big picture, is this the danger, and how do different kinds of dangers interact? But if you start to really make predictive, almost mechanical modeling of where or what kind of conflict likely to break out and so on, then we're opening a whole new political can of worms, and we'll probably have to face up to that. And it has some interesting similarities to what we talk about here. It's a very interesting question.
Carina, I would also like to ask you about, you could say, the role of Europe. Now we know that the Brits have just announced in the new security policy that they're going to actually develop new nuclear weapons, and you know, I guess that France is thinking of something as well. So, but what is actually the role of Europe and the EU within the whole setting of, you could say, nuclear dynamics and other kinds of weapon systems?
Well, I think, as on so many other questions, Europe is a tribe of very different opinion holders on these questions. And I think it's very much, I mean, this links into the question of risk assessments as well, because culture always affects how you reason about these things. There's, of course, the science that you can apply to a question of threat and risk assessment, but there's also the cultural perspective. Who are we as a nation? Who do we want to be? What are our historical experiences? And how do we see where we're placed in the world? And I think, I mean, Europe is challenged by having member states that have very, very different concerns, typically, when it comes to nuclear weapons issues. So the nuclear weapon state holders, I mean, the main question they have to consider, they come to these strategic points in time when their nuclear weapons are in need of refurbishment, because, I mean, just like a car also needs to be changed out every so often, that happens to nuclear weapons as well. And in these significant shifts, there is a possibility for a new public debate to happen on these issues. But typically, what we see is that the general population isn't really so very interested, and I mean, the threat seems to have passed. People are confused about should we still be concerned about this issue? Why are nuclear weapons still here? So there's a lot of it's not a straightforward issue when you think about the domestic politics of the question. And then, of course, the strategic cultures of France and the UK have their own unique history to them. And that has a lot to do with how do we perceive also the US as an ally. And I think, actually, in this context, the accession of Trump to power hasn't helped the disarmament logic necessarily in France and the UK for the time being, although it has actually it has further radicalized some of the already committed arms controllers in the US. They've become more aware of issues of authority and how many people should actually be involved in taking the most momentous decisions on behalf of a population of over 300 million. Should that really rest on only one person? What kind of political system is that? And what type of person do you expect can possibly be elected in the future? I mean, this is actually a very live debate in the US at the moment in expert communities, because this is actually a very real concern for the future. So we might actually see this being reopened as a very serious topic, and Biden might look into that.
And was that because of Trump and his personality that they were concerned about that? Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
And I mean, we saw Nancy Pelosi contacting the heads of the military after the attack on the U.S. Congress. I mean, it's the closest we have been to an actual authoritarian overthrow. So I think there's a greater humility among US security and strategy analysts about both the logic of deterrence, which is actually, it's still very much an accepted, this is going to continue forever, more or less. There's a growing recognition that you have to look at authority questions, that deterrence is maybe not the most perfect construction for the future, and nobody knows what the politics of tomorrow will actually bring.
Then, yes,
thank
I was thinking actually the role of CIPRI, you're very well known, internationally, and also, but what do you do in terms of policymakers, both the US or the European? Do you have any influence in terms of, getting them together? I know your figures are cited in the World Bank numbers, for example, and they refer to your research and data.
Yeah, I think it's always a little bit difficult to be absolutely sure of what kind of impact one is having amongst the world of policymakers, in part because policymakers very often don't want to acknowledge that they got their ideas and thoughts from somewhere else.
Yeah.
But for the last few years, we've worked quite productively and successfully, constructively, I think, together with the Swedish government and with the German government about disarmament agendas and arms control possibilities in relation to Europe and in relation to the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, and in general, in the middle of when it seemed like the last vestiges of bilateral arms control between the US and Russia were going to collapse. What could be the alternatives at that point, and what influence could the small and medium powers in Europe bring to bear? I think that this wasn't really possible through the EU institutions, partly because the EU doesn't necessarily still as a whole think of itself as an actor on these issues, and partly because Britain hadn't left the EU at that point. It was on the way out, and it was an irritant, but it hadn't left. So it was much easier to be working in relation to Sweden, Germany, Canada, and so on, and as well as with other governments. On other issues, I think we feel that we have an audience amongst policymakers who are interested to listen. Much of what we have to say about the intersection of climate change and security and insecurity issues gets a really quite immediate hearing, and has led to changes in policy and changes in action at both national and international levels. So it's mixed, and it's very often hard to trace. I think we've been being kind of very depressing about a lot of the issues, and I do, before I say the optimistic thing, I do agree with Carina's point right at the beginning that one of the main threats is that this issue is not being properly discussed in the way that it was in the 1980s. Although remember that it wasn't really being properly discussed in the 1970s, it was in the 1960s, and it wasn't really in the 1950s. It's come and gone in waves. But I do think that at the moment, we have more knowledge, more understanding, more capacity to be grasping and communicating these issues than we have ever had. And I think that the difficulty is that the public mind, and the policy mind, in fact, and the political mind, have so many different issues of whatever we call this age. What is it? Post-modernity, or the age of extremes, or however we describe this age. There are so many challenges that the mind is trying to address that sometimes it can seem as if on any issue one is, shouting into a void and there's nobody there to hear. But actually, I think there are. I think there is a considerable degree of concern about these different issues, about cyber, about the environment, about the nuclear issue, about geopolitics turning very toxic. And I think that there's a lot of concern amongst people across the generations. Certainly in Europe, certainly in North America, as people have talked about, but I also find it more broadly as well, more widely, so that there is quite a significant international public constituency there. And the last thing that I will say, which I actually meant to say earlier because you are asking about kind of policy influence, Charlotte, we're doing a lot of work at the moment on disarmament education especially for diplomats. One thing that we do feel has slipped away is knowledge and understanding amongst those who should be negotiating the disarmament issues. Their knowledge, their familiarity with some of the more detailed issues has slipped. And so we're putting quite a lot of effort into trying to address that problem.
Thank you. And Ole, you also had a commentary
Yeah,
to
I have two things. I think
Yeah.
that what Dan is saying here at the end, I think is quite. I heard an optimistic tone, and I think you're right that there is maybe more of a public attention to some of the new issues, and also climate change is clearly becoming the driver of a new perspective on many other things. So I mean, climate change is clearly widely recognized as the biggest danger in many different ways, and also a sense that we have to adjust our way of thinking about things in general because of that. And then I think gradually we're beginning to see that there are other dangers that have some similarities to that. So some of these new technologies and the kind of collective dangers and the dangers from not being able to control who develops the technologies and so on, they have some similarities there, which I think means that actually we can see a strange spilling back towards the classical issues, because then everyone thinks that nuclear weapons are lost, but from starting to think about the new dangers, we might actually rediscover the old ones, because I think Dan is onto something really important. The kind of lack of continuity of the knowledge we used to have is a big challenge. So we have to reinvent a lot of this knowledge. And just what I was reminded of when you had to ask the question about Europe is the danger of completely stupid discussions coming up. Like another Trump spillover was discussions coming out of Germany about, well, if we aren't no longer under the American nuclear umbrella, do we then need the European nuclear umbrella? Which would be the wrong answer to a non-existent question, that Germany would not be in a new danger because there's no American nuclear umbrella. And so it's a false question, but the way that whole discussion unfolded was like, wow, we have forgot everything we knew about deterrence and nuclear strategy and so on from the Cold War days. So there is a relearning that is necessary, but it's probably going to be a relearning through the other development. We can't go back and reread Cold War history and so on. We will be thinking about the nuclear issue modeled on the new dangers, and maybe climate change is kind of the mother of all dangers there that is going to define how we look at a lot of other issues.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Ole. Thank you, Carina. It was fantastic and fascinating, and it's a discussion not over.